Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma231 here, back in today to talk about Navigatoria, extra chapter number 5. This chapter is split into two parts, the first part being called Class 8, and the second part being called Anastasia. But this entire chapter is about the character Anastasia, who so far we've seen in the series a few times. Mainly she is the one who pushed Navi down into the cave and the main bullier of Navi in Class A. And really, even though the first part is called Class A and then the second part is Anastasia, this entire chapter really revolves around Anastasia completely, right? And the other thing about, of course, this is an extra chapter of Navigatoria, but for all things considered, this should just be like a regular canon chapter of the manga. Not saying the extra chapters aren't canon, but I don't understand why this isn't just a named chapter like chapter 23, which of course last time we talked about chapter 22, and then we have this extra chapter number 5, and then we go into chapter number 23 next time, right? So there is no reason for this chapter not to particularly be one of those, but I guess this is not a story that the author, of course, Waka Oishishi, wanted to have in the main story itself, right? Either way, this is honestly one of my favorite chapters of Navigatoria because of the complete story that gets told here. I honestly feel like with a lot of the extra chapters, it brings a lot of points into you're like, yeah, that makes sense is in this galactic this intergalactic connected school tale story that a lot of these stories would be told, and that is one that we definitely get here in this chapter. Now, I would go about here, talk about what happened last time in Navigatoria, but it doesn't particularly matter massively for what goes on in this chapter, besides for the fact of knowing that, okay, Navi is back in school currently after the whole events of the cave exploration mission and all of that yada yada stuff. And, of course, in the last chapter, we saw a brief glimpse of, Anastasia again, but we didn't really see her too in depth. Well, this chapter, like I said, is almost completely revolved around Anastasia. Now, to open up this chapter, we actually start off with Anastasia talking to Navi, as she's just saying, like, hey, you've become quite cheeky, huh? You're going to decline even though I so graciously invited you, and here I thought I'd try to be your friend. As we understand pretty much that Anastasia has come up to Navi and is like, hey, I invited you out to come do something with me, and because you are this, a Dimendlian from this planet, and I am so much better than you are, pretty much, to like, hey, because of all of that, I'm pretty much just good up in your face, and because I view you as a lower race than me, of course, which isn't necessarily the case, so we know Navi's just as good as any of the other students who come here to this school. We understand Anastasia is just sort of getting on that case because of all of that, right? And at this point, we see that Charlie comes over and sort of like reaches out a hand in front of Navi and just says like, hey, give it a rest, Anastasia. And like, she said no, and that means no. And we get a little bit of an image of Anastasia's very like frowned and furrowed brow, and Charlie's eyes who've just like looked in this moment to say like, hey, don't you be doing that. Like, that's also super messed up, right? As we see that, of course, Anastasia, who is still having to use crutches to actually walk around, we see that she and one of her other friends who are badly injured in the whole cave exploration thing end up walking off further into the classroom, right? As we see Charlie and a lot of the other Class A students come over and just like, hey, I'm sorry about all of that, Navi. Like, Anastasia's really been, like, hovering around you until recently, like, so we couldn't reach out to you earlier, and, like, hey, we don't want to hurt you, and, like, hey, we're so sorry. As we understand, like, yes, Navi does have a support group in her class, but because Anastasia's, like, so much of an overbearing character, all of these students have not been able to really get to know Navi as well as they honestly should have been throughout the entire time of going to the Navigatoria school this far, right? Charlie just says like, hey, you probably can't trust all of us right away, but we always wanted to be friends with you, Navi, right? And we now see like Navi sort of like takes off this in and just has a little bit of a smile as all of this happens, right? We then cut to Manabu, who is studying in the library, as he's like, man, alright, I just finished up a book, and we see he's like closing one of these textbooks or something. He's like, alright, that's all my studying and everything for a day, let me go and leave the library. He gets up, walks out the door, and as he's leaving the library, we see that Navi runs all the way up next to Manabu. And Manabu's like, oh, hey, Navi, what's going on? And Navi's like, Manabu, hey, right? But Manabu says, like, hey, so I guess school isn't causing you any more trouble, Nabi? And she's like, nope, not at all. And she's like, hey, I stopped being so fixated on trying to be friends with everyone, right? As you get a little bit of the second part of that message just in Navi's mind, and she's just like, yeah, all because now I know that I can't get along with everyone, and there are some Earth people who just don't accept me, right? And as she says this to Manabu, she sort of leaves Manabu staying wherever he is, as we see that he is going into his house because Navi walked that direction with him. Because, of course, Navi's house is, as we saw last chapter, very out in the middle of absolute nowhere, pretty much, right? And Navi's like, all right, Manabu, well, I'll see you again later at school, right? And Navi's like, okay, cool, sounds good, I'll be liking to see you there. As we pan out from this image where, of course, Manabu is entering his house, as we see that Anastasia is looking on in this moment, and she's like, oh, let's take him from her. Dun, 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 dun. Is like, oh no, what is Anastasia doing now? Well, we cut to the next day of school, where we see Manabu is walking through the various halls of the school building, and eventually, in front of him is Anastasia and about 7 other members of Class A, or I don't know if these are all members of Class A, or just other general members of the school, pretty much, right? And Anastasia's like, hey, Manabu, join my group of subordinates, right? And Manabu's like, what are you talking about? Like, I think I'll do a hard pass on one of those, right? And we see that because Manabu sort of turned Anastasia down here, Anastasia sort of gets, like, very up and mighty, and she's like, hey, I hail from the fortress nation Necrogania, right? And Manabu's like, okay, so you're, like, trying to tell me where you air from? It still doesn't change my answer. I mean, who cares? You're the one who bullied Navi, aren't you? And he's like, I heard as much from Charlie, at least, right? And Anastasia's like, oh, golly, like, refusing my offer means becoming my enemy. Are you truly okay with that, Manabu, right? And Manabu's just like, hey, I don't care, just do whatever you want to, right? But as Manabu is walking away from this situation, he sort of comes to the realization, oh, wait a second, isn't Necrogania, like, a pretty big nation? Like, maybe making an enemy of her may have just been a mistake. Maybe I should have become her subordinate, right? We see that he then walks to his class as he goes over to Aiden's desk and is like, hey, Aiden, and he's like, oh, wait, that's right. Aiden isn't here right now. As he eventually walks over to Riko-tan's desk and says, like, hey, Riko-tan, you don't happen to know anything about, the nation Necrogania, do you? And Riko-tan just is like, hey, well, don't you know, Necrogania is the biggest nation in the northern area. They say it has about the same military strength as Dominos, right? Which, of course, Dominos is, Riko-tan, or the Dominos Empire is Riko-tan's home planet, right? Or home nation, or whatever it is, right? Riko-tan then just says, like, hey, being that, like, he knows, who the leader of Necrogania is, like, hey, did Anastasia do something to you? And Manabu's like, yeah, she sorta did, right? As we go out into the hallway where we see that Riko-tan has ended up walking with Manabu to go through and end up confronting Anastasia on all of these topics, pretty much, right? As Riko-tan's just like, hey, long time no see, Anastasia. And we see that Anastasia gets very happy to see Riko-tan in this moment. And she's like, oh my gosh, Riko-tan, you remembered me, right? And Manabu's like, oh, well, I sort of see where this is going. The two of you know each other, don't you, right? As we sort of get, like, a little bit of an explanation of, like, hey, in the past, Riko-tan's nation, of course, the Dominos Empire, and Anastasia's nation, Necrogania, often went to several summits with each other, and because of that, both Anastasia and Riko-tan met each other while they were kids, while they were at, like, dinner socials with their parents, pretty much, right? And to all this point, we now sort of cut back into reality where Riko-tan is like, hey, would you mind leaving Manabu alone? And we see Anastasia's like, oh, of course, I'm sorry, Riko-tan. I did not realize that he was already your servant boy. Like, my complete bad there. She's like, oh man, so silly of me. I am so sorry, Riko-tan, right? And Manabu's like, oh man, like, she's got it totally wrong. Like, what is all this? And that is where we end the portion of this chapter right here, with this little bit of a funny joke that's like, oh man, ha ha ha. Anastasia thinks Manabu is that subordinate, right? But we then see that Anastasia goes on and she just says, like, hey, Well, after this little bit of an event here's happened here, we see that Anastasia goes and meets up with some of her friends in this moment, and she started talking with them about making a new plan, being that the whole thing with Manabu won't work since Manabu is supposedly Rikotan's servant already, so she can't take him from Navi. She's like, hey, she's talking to one of her friends, she's like, hey, long story short, I think I've come up with a different angle on what to do here. And we see that one of her friends refers to her as Madam Anastasia. And she says, like, hey, shouldn't you focus on your studies and training for the time being? As we see that Anastasia's like, don't you be talking to me like that, right? As we see her friend just says, like, hey, as you know, the tests are super close after all, right? And Anastasia's just not listening to this whatsoever, and she just says, like, okay then, getting dirt on Navi is more important than that right now. Meet up with me at my dorm after school. As we see that she walks out of the room, and we see a bunch of her other friends around there. Not really friends, more of the people she was raised with, as you'll get later in this chapter. They come up around and says like, hey, but Madam Anastasia has such bad grades. As we see that Anastasia walks out of this classroom door, she sees an image of Charlie, Navi, and another one of the Class A girls all having a fun, good time together. Well, at this point, we switch over to the second half of this chapter, which is the more bonus chapter Anastasia-based part of it. As we see that Anastasia is meeting with her Class A teacher in this moment. As the teacher comes over and just says like, hey, Anastasia. And she's like, oh, Mr. Locke, how are you doing today, right? As we see that her teacher, Locke, just comes over and just says like, hey, you went way too far the other day, pushing Navi down that hole. And she's like, what do you mean? Like, why? That Dementian was cheating. And she's like, hey, on top of being born smart, she gets even more support from the Earth Army, right? And Teacher Locke just says like, hey, that's besides the point, right? But Anastasia's not listening to this whatsoever, just saying like, hey, in the leadership game, they lent her heavy machinery to build an entire symbol, right? And they offered her advice too. And Locke just says like, hey, here's the thing, Anastasia, like, unlike all of you, Navi has no nation to back her up. So we don't have another choice. We sort of have to help her out here, right? And Anastasia's like, hey, regardless, it doesn't matter. I was only enforcing justice here. And she's like, hey, we're done talking. And she turns around and starts to leave the room. As the teacher just says like, hey, no, you're actually not. As Teacher Locke leans down and says like, hey, Anastasia, your mother is here. And we're about to have a parent-teacher conference. As we now get a little bit of a flashback in this moment to whenever Anastasia was a young girl at the nation of course, Necrogania, and her mother, as we see a little bit of an image where Anastasia is sitting down, and her mother comes up to her and just puts a hand on her head and just says like, hey, you're special. You can do it, Anastasia. You're my little treasure. As we now cut from this scene into a little bit of a conference room, which we were described to as 3 years ago as a giant student forum for Northern Region high schoolers organized by Necrogania. As we see that a bunch of various students that currently are going to the Navigatoria school are all sitting down here, including Anastasia, and as you'll see, all of her other various friends in this moment. As we see that Anastasia's mom walks up behind all of this group and just is like, hey, fantastic work on your presentation for the Northern Region's prosperity, everyone. That was a wonderful discussion I just heard. As we see, like, Anastasia's like, oh, yes, mother, thank you very much. And a bunch of the other classmates here just like, oh, man, it's an honor, your majesty, right? As we see that Anastasia's mother then just says, like, hey, I think I can trust you all to get the job done. After you all graduate high school, you will be enrolled in an off-planet school together with my daughter. And we see 7 other faces here who are, of course, the 7 other cronies that sort of Anastasia has in her sort of group of friends, pretty much, right? As we get a little bit of narration just going like, hey, 7 of the northern area students were chosen by the Queen of Necrogania. She is incredibly powerful, the most noble, strongest, and most righteous person in the whole world. That is who my mother is. As we now cut to the present, where of course this parent-teacher conference is going on between Teacher Locke, or actually it's not between Teacher Locke. We see that Teacher Locke is here, but we also see that Gray Goodman, the teacher of Class D, is also here. Also, I don't know why he is here, being this seems like it should be just like a Class A responsibility, so I don't know why he's here, but it's between Locke, Anastasia, and of course Anastasia's mother, the Queen of Necrogania. And we see in this moment that she's just going, hey, I am so incredibly sorry for my daughter's behavior. And we see that Anastasia is very, very much freaked out by this. Of course, seeing her mother in this moment acting not like the noble woman that, of course, Anastasia has always thought her mother to be, right? And we see that her mother's just going like, hey, I understand that hurting another academy student is an offense worthy of expulsion. However, I shall see to it that Anastasia receives a stern talking to, so please, right? As we see a Teacher Locke just goes like, hey, I beg of you, like, please raise your head, right? And Gray Goodman just says like, hey, actually, if this happens again, Anastasia will be expelled. We at the school have already decided on all of that. And we see that Anastasia's mother just goes like, yes, that definitely seems fair. We now see this parent-teacher conference is majorly over as we get this verdict of like, okay, Anastasia is not being expelled. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Like, it seems like she should. I mean, she did, like, do attempted murder on a student almost. And, like, hey, Aiden doesn't show up for school for, like, a week because his arm is completely broken or chomped off, more likely. But he still gets expelled. But she tried to attempted murder. But she gets stayed to school. It's sort of like a little bit of a mixed signal there. But whatever, I'm not really too worried about it. We see Anastasia's mother is talking with Anastasia outside of the parent-teacher conference room. As we see, she's like, dear Anastasia, let us have a little talk. As we see that outside of the door, we go back inside where we see that Gray Goodman and Teacher Locke are both talking with each other. And Gray Goodman's just like, man, meeting with her was quite nerve-wracking, wouldn't you say so? And he's like, hey, to think a sovereign of such a powerful nation would just make a trip of 10 days just to come to a parent-teacher conference for her daughter, right? And we see that Professor Locke just is like, hey, I hear that she traveled in secret, leaving a body double behind. Is like, but this is actually a very big deal for Anastasia's mother to come here for this conference, right? And talk for her daughter. As we see that outside, Anastasia is just crying over all of this stuff. She's just like, man, mother, I was wrong, wasn't I? I did something to make you bow your head to another. What have I done? As her mother just says, Anastasia, you must win. As long as you win, you are just. The way you are doing things now, you are surely going to lose. And if you win, this planet will be yours. And you can turn the Demethlians into pets if you please. As Anastasia's like, but mother, how am I supposed to? But her mother just says like, oh dear, you must figure that out for yourself. I'm sure you already have an idea of what you need to do now, don't you, Anastasia? As we see that later, Anastasia's mother has left, and Anastasia goes up and meets with all of her other friends. As she just says like, hey, guys, please help me study, won't you? As we see that all of her friends are just like, yeah, of course. I mean, you're finally motivated. This is like all what we wanted to hear. Like, if you're finally going to stop bullying everyone and do something productive, it's not like we could tell you to stop, but I'm glad we can do all of this. Like, we are going to do this all and help you out so much, Anastasia. We all love you pretty much, right? And Anastasia sort of just freaks out, just like, man, mother, I will do my best to try to bring glory to Necrogania. As that is where we end this chapter of Navigatoria on this, like, very, very happy note of, like, hey, we get a reform for this character of Anastasia, who, so far we have seen, is just a terrible person, all things considered, but we see that as time, this character growth happens, and, like, we can tell that she is very much scared of her mother, and not particularly scared, but more upset about what she has made her mother do, is, like, the ruler of a powerful nation, bending down and like bowing to somebody else who's not even on the level of greatness that she views her mother on. In this moment, we can see that this really has a big impact on Anastasia, and because of this, she's like, hey, I will do whatever my mother wants me to do if that means I can be in sort of her good graces, and also just make her be proud of me, pretty much, right? There's a little bit of like a mixed signal here, as of course the whole thing of like, hey, dear Anastasia, as long as you win, everything is fine. Like, hey, as long as you commit 100,000 murders. I mean, that's the whole thing of war. It's like, hey, kill thousands, 100,000 of people, and as long as you win, you're fine. It doesn't matter. Which is sort of the whole thing there, so it makes sense. Being this is like a story about nations at war and all of that sort of stuff going on. Yeah, that message is a little bit conflicting there, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. I just thought this was a very awesome chapter, just going through and understanding more about Anastasia. And I really hope she becomes more of an outgoing character and part of our main cast, because I not only really like Anastasia's design, but I also like this character development we've gotten, and I'd love to see her actually being a good friend to Navi in the future, instead of just being like this terrible person, all things considered. Yeah, and with all of that said, thank you guys so very much for watching this video on Navigatoria Extra Chapter number 5, again called Class A and then Anastasia, or just Class A Anastasia, which also is just a fine name for the chapter also. But yeah, I do plenty of other anime manga related content here on the channel, and if you did like this review of Navigatoria, I've also done plenty of other Navigatoria chapter reviews. At this point, I think like 3 or 4 of them, if I'm not mistaken, like not that many, but still a few. I think this is maybe the 4th one I've done, so I'm trying to do the series because I actually really enjoy the series and I want to talk more about it, all things considered, right? But there's going to be a playlist at the end of this video, a link in the description. Also, just go check out my channel. Like I said, I do plenty of other anime and manga related content, and I will check you guys next time for chapter number 23 of Navigatoria. Again, this was extra chapter number 5, Class A Anastasia, and I will catch you guys next time. This will be Glowplasma 231, signing out.